Hello and welcome to a bit of a random one. The Washington cherry trees video, which was a live and a patron requested one, has generated a huge number of interesting comments. And I could say it's me being lazy that I'm replying by doing another video to talk about them. But more it is the case of some of them are better answered with visual aids, and if I'm honest, I've got the recording systems all set up and all working. It makes more sense for my time to do it this way, rather than spending typing time, which I'm doing at the moment, which is writing some articles. Well, writing an article for my book to be published about my book in Britain at War magazine, which is rather cool. Prepping for a upcoming appearance I have where I'll be discussing Dogger Bank somewhere, and some other work I've got going on, of course, with a new office coming in the garden. So it just seemed more efficient this way. With that, the great thing I find about the questions is what I do is I go to the video in question and I then work through the questions that way. And some of them I have actually replied to people on, but there are many, many comments, and mostly from Hugh Fisher, Sir Galen Tyrrell, Andrew Cox, and John Evans, GeoGuy001. All of you have commented very, very cool stuff. Let's start off with Hugh Fisher's. He's edited it, so it might not be the same one you originally saw. On retaining admirals, G-freeze and N-freeze for negotiation, I think cancellation was the safer option. I don't believe Britain post-World War I could afford new battleships and new cruisers. I may not be surprised if the civilian government had quietly told the RN that they had to pick which was more important, and the RN said cruisers. They could have tried to use the ships for negotiating concessions, but that seems to me one of those plans that relies on potential, in this case, enemies doing exactly what you need them to do. If they don't, Britain were building 3 more admirals, then 4 G-freeze and 4 N-freeze. USA, okay, treaty limit of 48,000 tons, standard displacement and 18-inch guns. Japan, fine with us. USA, Britain, that gives you 22 capitals, 12 of them new build. We have 18. Our new build will be 1 more Washington 16-inch, then 6 Dakotas and 4 Lexingtons. Japan, you've only got 10, 6 new build. Japan, mumbling, like I said, 2 Kagas, 2 Amagis, 2 Keys. Britain, don't you want to haggle? USA could certainly afford to build new and bigger ships. Japan might not have been able to match Britain overall, but they could afford at least as many new battleships, if not more. Safer for the RN to set a standard they safer for the RN not set a standard they couldn't actually meet. This again, Tillon then sort of gets to the point. I would dispute 2 things about that, Hugh. One, the idea that Britain couldn't afford to build battleships. This might sound strange, but actually for Britain, building ships was a fairly sensible economic proposition. It would employ a lot of people, just as there were a lot of people coming back into the country who were hunting for jobs, i.e. the demobilizing army and navy. New build cruisers weren't really being built. The cruisers which were being completed were the C's, D's, and E's, which had all been started during wartime. So it wasn't really new build, it was end of war construction being finished off. And furthermore, you have to remember, when I say this, I say it in knowledge of who is the American president, Wilson, who of course has a peace plan, he wants to deliver it, and the US Senate, who, despite all the treaty allowances, never build up to treaty and never want to fund the US Navy to the full length they could do in the 1920s and 30s. So That is the basic point. I think the admirals, as I said, they're cancelled, but my point would have been to change those to admirals or G3s to change them to carriers. The free admirals are further along than the G3s, but I think the admirals have been pretty much cancelled by this point, and the G3s have been started. So the admirals aren't really a factor. The admirals are cancelled in favour of the G3s. So the admirals are already off the board. So that's 3 gone. There's 1 being built, Hood, but that's it. You've got 4 G3s and 4 N3s. So you've got actually 8 new build ships being up for option. Also, you have to decide how many of the Grand Fleet Britain's prepared to get rid of, how many of the older battleships they're prepared to get rid of. They might well, and this is again, let's go, we've got these new ships, we're allowing these new ships, we're going to cut old ships. So they could have gone that route. As in, we're going to give up more of the older ships. Got rid of the R ships after World War One. There are lots of options. My main point is that unilaterally cancelling weapon systems and unilaterally deciding you're not going to do it before you've even negotiated in the treaty is not very sensible. As for the 48,000 ton standard displacement and 18-inch guns, that wouldn't have again hurt Britain. It's going to sound strange. Having bigger ships doesn't necessarily hurt Britain. Would Britain build to 48,000 tons? Probably not. If it's got a maximum number of hulls, it's allowed, or it depends if that is the maximum number of ships of that tonnage. Then they're only allowed this number of ships. Then they might as well build the full tonnage. If it's a tonnage of ships, they're allowed. And remember, that Britain does have this thing with the cruisers. If they could get away with a tonnage restriction for battleship construction and a tonnage restriction for various things, then you would probably see Britain would focus in on more slightly smaller ships. Again, from the perspective of having them in more places. I understand where you're coming from in terms of talking about the finances, but you always have to be careful at looking at Britain post-World War One and post the Great Recession and post-World War Two. And there is a difference in terms of its economic position. Post-World War One, okay, it's not fantastic, but it's by no means down the tube. And the fact is, they have no qualms about building Nelson and Rodney. And I know people go, but they're smaller ships, and we'll get into that later. They are smaller ships than were planned, but they're still not cheap ships. There's nothing cheap about the amount of armor you're putting in. There's nothing cheap about the engines. And honestly, if you order them earlier, you probably get the ships cheaper because you're ordering 4, so you've got a certain level of, well, actually 8 ships, and you're ordering very similar things for each of them. So you've got kind of a quantity coming down. And there's a nice little discussion going on between you and Sir Galanterrell about the cost. And that's, Sir Galanterrell makes the point, they were short of money, but not that short. They didn't want to spend it, but they could spend it. There's a difference between wanting to spend it and being could have. The admirals were not. The admirals were gone. I talk about the admirals being turned into aircraft carriers, but honestly, the admirals, they're gone almost as soon as the G3s are ordered. And the reason the admirals are gone is because when you've waited that long to build them, they got so convoluted and complicated designs that, frankly, it's better to start from scratch. You're only building one. The N3s were, I would recommend, a bluff. And they were something to definitely be cancelled. But I think the G3s were a serious thing. And they make a lot of sense for Britain in terms of their capabilities. But as said, I think they would have been, at least two, if not more of them, would have been converted to aircraft carriers. That would have been the interesting thing. I have a feeling it would have been a case of 4 converted to carriers. And that would have been the British carrier force. And I think the Americans would have done the same. And Japan would have done the same. If they're done still on the 7710 limit. I'm not sure if they get 3. If they get 3, it's okay. If they get 4, Japan could have the case of building a new build ship entirely from scratch, so they could convert the first 3, wait a bit, operate them, and then build a new 30,000 ton carrier from scratch. That would be interesting to think. It would also probably raise the tonnage limit to about. Well, they wouldn't have the turrets, which are pretty darn heavy things. They really are heavy things, the turrets systems. They're sort of talking about putting them in. But I wouldn't be surprised if you're looking at about 30. You're definitely looking at Lexington, Saratoga size, if not slightly bigger in terms of tonnage. So could be looking at 36,000 tons being a limit. They could be designed for 33,000 tons, but it would be complicated. I also don't think you're misunderstanding quite a bit how successful Britain was at running the board. At Washington, Britain was pretty successful in terms of that one. Now, and the conversion of battle cruisers to carriers is pretty available as an idea. So, but it's good questions, and it's a good discussion for it between you and Sigel. Right. Sigel makes his own point. Why did Nelson and Rodney only displace 33,800 tons instead of out of the 35,000 ton limit? It seems like they compromised the guns by making them too light when they didn't need to. P.S. Using the exponential rule of thumb regulator of power and speed, you'd expect to get more like 25.5 knots, not 28 knots, out of an N3 with 90,000 shaft horsepower. That's possibly a bit of a pessimistic estimation, so call it 26 knots. Fair, it took King George the KG5s 110,000 shaft horsepower to make 28 knots, and that was in a lighter ship. It's also in honestly, a not as well designed hull in some respects. The N3 definitely has, I would say, the better hull for higher speed. But you can work that out from the way they're orientated. That should be better. Now, why did Nelson and Rodney only displace 33,800 tons? Again, because Britain are starting to play the numbers game. They're starting to work out what they can build. They're sort of thinking about the tonnage. But also, there is an advantage for them in making them look smaller. So they're 33,800 tons. What would you do extra with the extra 1,200 tons if you had it? What would you put it into? What would it get you? And more importantly, would it be worth it? Or can you use water and various other things for armor and make your life nice by saying, ours are only 33,800 tons? I have to say I do sort of roughly agree, but my calculation was taking into idea the hull form and like you've been generous giving it 26 knots. I had it at about 27 and a half, so I'd rounded up to roughly 28 in my head. But yeah, I was basing it on hull form. They're interesting ships. I still don't like where their guns are. I do not like that. I'm sorry. This is why I'd quite happily keep the G3s around as aircraft carriers. I'm not really keen on them as warships. Andrew Cox, in your 4 large N3 base fleet carrier scenario, what would have happened to the Japanese carrier plans after the earthquake? Nagi was not salvageable. The treaty didn't permit new builds. As I've said, there were a 7-10 limit, so it may have been they were allowed free. And whilst not allowed new build battleships, new build carriers were allowed. So their option would be the Japanese building the first from scratch fleet strike carrier. Dr. Clark, would you expect the 27,000 tonnage limit have to have been applied to such a new build? But as I've put there, if they're allowing 33,000 tons, difficult to see how they couldn't allow them to do that. But it does depend, as Andrew Cox put, how nasty the UK and US wanted to be, and could they insist on Nagi's hull or limited the alternative to 27,000? If not, the Japanese potentially had the chance to do a purpose-built 33,000 rather than a battlecruiser conversion. As I said to myself earlier, do it last after you've had a Kagi and Kaga for a few years, and potentially you get the most powerful pre-war carrier in Japanese hands. This is true. And of course, with the earthquake, you do lose your ship. So, yeah, they could have had the new build. There is another option. They could have been limited to 27,000 tons, or the others might not have been allowed the full 4. They might have only been allowed 3, which is an option. It's something which you've got to negotiate, and you've got to think about, might they only allow 3 for both America and Britain, in which case they'd allow Japan 2 and go, that's what you're allowed on the 7-10 agreement. It's interesting. But the other option, of course, is they get 4 each, America and the UK, and Japan gets a third. And they do get a new build. Interesting question is, what effect would this have on subsequent treaty limits? If you've got that many 33,000 ton ships going around, and people are getting used to them and liking them, what does it have effect on the tonnage limits when you are negotiating subsequent treaties? The London treaties. One can argue that the London treaties are negotiated in part with the idea that the other ships are perfectly adequate. But you can see the moment that Britain starts to sort of Ark Royal and the Illustrious class, it's the two and Unicorn are the 3 sides of the coin as far as Britain's having to build its carriers terms. It needs its carriers to be battle carriers, as in the Illustrious class, or armored hangar carriers, really, in that they have to be able to survive the fighting if they're going into the Mediterranean or going to operating on the other side of the world, so they can take some damage and keep on operating. You need a strike carrier like Ark Royal, which will carry enough aircraft to take out the enemy fleet in harbour, because that's a critical asset for you. You don't want the enemy hiding. And you need HMS Unicorn to fulfill the cruiser carrier long-range deployment options, but also in wartime the maintenance and support ship, which is officially designed under. So she's not technically a carrier, in order to provide you with enough supplies to keep your fleet operating at the distance. under the British standards of efficiency. Arguably, the British don't really satisfy themselves with this until you get to the Malta-class design, or indomitable and implacable and indefatigable in service, to an extent. And certainly a 33,000-ton carrier would have been able to fit all those roles in. And whilst on one side, you would of course have people going, you need smaller carriers. Yes, you need smaller carriers. The British Treasury certainly likes the idea of value for money. And the thing is, the engine power for a 33,000-ton carrier is cheaper and easier to install than two 16,000-ton carriers. It's an extra 6,000 tons, but it makes a big difference. This is definitely well into what if history, though, and definitely a long way down the rabbit hole, so you can make your own arguments anyway. This is just my opinion on this one. There is no documents either way. The fact is, the British government made the decision. They cancelled the things before they even got to the negotiating table. I don't think Hugo is right in thinking it's a case of the costs. If they'd wanted to cancel them for that, the Treasury would have cancelled them long before then. They're powerful enough to do it. And would have modified them before then. Again, they're powerful enough to do it. What it is hubris of the highest order. Peace. Everyone wanted peace to break out. Everyone wanted the Great War to be the war to end all wars. You can understand their thinking. You can understand what they wanted. What they hoped for. But you can also find it pretty silly. John Evans. And this one's also been edited, but was first left 2 days ago. If I read that diagram correctly, X turret is blind, plus or minus 30 degrees of the centerline astern, and plus or minus 25 degrees forward. Any other British ship is only going to bring 2 guns to bear. I mean, presume 2 turrets to bear in those angles other than hood. Since the 13.5-inch and 15-inch Mark I turrets did not allow for superfiring to fire plus or minus 30 degrees of the centerline. At least that's what I've been led to believe due to the sighting of hoods. All true. However, the difference is she had no guns covering her rear. None at all. None whatsoever. And especially once I think you're doing treble turrets. That's a significant firepower. Let's be honest, you've got 4 double turrets, that's 4 guns. 1 treble turret has got 75% of your firepower in 1 turret. It means your forward position is now 50% stronger, and your aft is only 25% weaker. That's a good deal to me. That's a very good deal. Overall, you're what, 12.5% stronger? Hmm. And they are potentially very good ships. Don't get me wrong. I think as aircraft carriers, they would have been an excellent vessel. And I even think as battle cruisers, even with my admitted firm convictions against their capabilities in terms of the placement of their guns. Very, very firm convictions. They were good ships. They were a good design on paper. They had quality. And that's not something not everything does have. Right. Andrew Cox. There was a practical limit to gun size, as either you have to accept lower muzzle velocity or much worse barrel wear. Just look at some of the big land-based railway guns, where barrel wear was so great some guns had to have their bore measured after each shot. That is true. And in reality, I think even if there had been an restrained race, I don't think 18-inch would have satisfied people for long. I think they might have tried bigger, but then they would have reinvented the pre-dreadnought. And out of necessity, you'd have had probably not 12-inch. Everyone was going 12-inch guns would appear as the side guns. No, I'd reckon it'd be 13.5-inch guns would appear. And you probably have 6-inch tertiary batteries for countering destroyers, which would be interesting to manage. I think you would probably end up with three paired 18-inch guns, turrets on the center line, and probably three paired 13.5-inch guns, 2 wings and 1 centerline aft in Y position behind it, sort of in from X, which would be the sternmost, and probably a festoon amount of 6-inch guns around it as well, and 4-inch or 4.5s at some point once they start, or 5.25 maybe even AA weaponry, but it would be heavy. I'm not sure I really like it. Be cool to look at. I'm not sure I really like it. It would also have to be very, very heavy. As it was, you could almost get away with an 18-inch without it having that rate of fire. But at a certain point, someone's going to try bigger, find it doesn't work, and then they're going to work out what's the only way we can make the 18-inch better. Well, we need something to fire faster, because otherwise, as you pointed out, the barrel will be destroyed. The way you can fire faster is have some smaller guns, but you can't go that small and still be able to punch through armor. And you end up with a system, and this is going to sound quite complicated, but it works quite well, where the 18-inch guns, or maybe larger, are used to sort of soften the enemy up. So you're firing your smaller shells at them. You're unlikely to hit any armor which is designed at the ranges you're engaging to withstand 18-inch fire, or have a chance of withstanding 18-inch fire, at least the first hit. Second hit on the same spot, no, it's not going to last. Is going to probably defeat 13.5-inch. But if your 13.5-inch keeps firing rapidly, well, rapidly compared to the 18-inch, then the likelihood of that being the second shell hitting in roughly the same vicinity as the 18 inches hit becomes slightly higher. Again, if the 18 inches already hit, that armor's gonna be pummeled. At which point the 13.5 inch can probably pierce it and cause a lot of damage. It's fun to think about, and I think it's War Thunder is the game I can design ships in, so I might go and play around and see if I can build it. But yeah, I'm not sure how. It would be a massive ship. It would be. You would have to widen Panama and probably Suez to get it to work. Interesting concept, though. Right. GeoGuy001. The cancelled scrapped Lexington battlecruisers were Constellation, Ranger, United States, and Constitution. So my hope is that if there was a third, it would be Constellation. And a fourth... I should say Ranger. Ranger was, of course, chosen for an aircraft carrier. But I'd love a USS Constitution aircraft carrier. I just think that'd be cool. Because it'd be Lexington, Saratoga, Constellation, and Constitution. And you just know, whilst they were the Lexington-class battlecruisers, someone would call them the Constitution-class aircraft carriers. Because that's a cool name for a class. It is if you're an American. It's a cool name for a class. Andrew Cox, if you did the N3 G3 as an all-forward design similar to Nelson, would you consider that worse or better than the Q turret design? Worse. Because... I understand why they do it in Nelson, Rodney. I really do. But no. John Evans. Sorry to have missed this. Have a lot of interest in the post-World War I designs before Washington ruined everything. Just need to find a free as, and I have a feeling this is going to lead to some interesting book purchases. Any recommendations? It's the Jordan books. It's Warships After Washington and Warships After Washington and Warships Out of London. Let me check. You can see those. Washington and London. The John Jordan books. They're excellent. And the Brassies from 1919 is pretty darn cool, and 1920 is fairly decent, as is the Transactions of Naval Institute. And then there's Andrew Cox, which says, regarding the ex-Kiwi Forces design, yes, it's a better design, but could you have built it with 20s technology and come in under 35,000 tons? Well, that is the interesting thing. Could I have built it with 20s technology and come in at only 35,000 tons? Well, how do I put this politely? You could, but you would probably have to make some changes. you would either have to thin down the armor a tad to spread it out over more space, which you can always do, or well, that and possibly rearrange the secondary turrets, or keep them in the same place, actually. That's a useful thing to do. But I'd be tempted. You see, if it was me, and I was doing this and saving weight, I would cut my defensive turrets down to 4, those side ones, or I'd even actually leave them at if I could with the weight, I'd still leave them at 6 and move our inwards. But I would put one turret in a Y position and one turret in a C position. Set the superstructure back further. Probably build the funnel stack into it a bit, which I know is going to make it interesting in terms of fitting radar later, but this is me with 20s technology. And then that gives me the equivalent of 8 6-inch guns. No, 8. It's 8 4.5, isn't it? Let me check. Actually, it's 6, isn't it? I was right. It was 6-inch. Sorry, I've been thinking so many about different battleship tonnages and guns. It's my brain's dyslexic brain is starting to get overloaded. It's fun when it happens. It can lead to some really weird ideas. Because then if you have the equivalent of a broadside of 9 16-inch guns and 8 6-inch guns, you have, well, you go from having what is an Arethusa class each side to having a Leander class cruiser each side, and an Arethusa class firing forward and an Arethusa class firing aft. Helpful. I would so love to up their engines, though. Could I do it on 35,000 tons? I think I could. But the changes I would make would mean I would have to be using water for armor, which is technically 20s technology and was far more of a part of certain ships. So yeah, I'd have to do some clever work, but I could do it. I could do it. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Later today, there will be the Great White Fleet live. That is why I haven't done a video on the questions of the Long Patrol for the Great White Fleet, because I'm going to save that video, which I probably will do next week at some point, for the questions on all the Long Patrols of the Great White Fleet and on the live. Any of the questions that I sort of left, because I have a feeling it's going to produce a few. And I hope you've enjoyed the question session and discussions of the G-Freeze and N-Freeze, the Washington cherry trees. They're cute ships in some ways. In some ways, he says. Not really sounding convinced. But let me just actually bring us back to quickly summarize this. And I'm going to go through to Not Nelson Rodney. Or the Dunkirk class. Although, see, I like the Dunkirk class idea because they use the aft for their aircraft, and you can't really argue against that. That makes sense. I don't like the layout of their secondary turrets, though, and their secondary armament, because those quadruples just look weird. I mean, especially if you're going to have 5.1 inch and you're going to have 3 quadruple and 2 twin. And that gives you what? 12 plus that, 16? Why not go for 5 trebles, which would actually look sensible? Even it out, and you'd still have 15 guns. And you have a broadside. Well, no. Let's see. You still have a broadside of 9, so you've only lost 1 from your broadside. Just, yeah. Anyway, so this is the G3. There is a lot of interesting technology here. There is a lot of interesting ideas. I think you could have used far more technology from this design to design Nelson and Rodney and getting that with a decent ship. And I don't say Nelson and Rodney are bad ships. Please note, I am not sitting here slamming them. They are what they are. What I'm saying is that especially the decision to have the Q turret, have the C turret drop down like it is in Nelson, whereas I would have a C turret when I'm talking about that secondary on at 6-inch, I would have that raised up above B, so it go A, B, C, sort of like a dado effect. It would be cool. Probably have to play around with the weight in the armor, but you could do it. You could. Would I have kept treble 16s rather than treble 15s? Yes. Yeah, treble 16s would have been good. No, they were good on Nelson and Rodney. I'm also sitting here looking at a hull and imagining it with all those guns stripped off, barring probably the 8 pair 6-inch turrets and the 4.7-inch AA guns and the 40 millimeters. Although you probably find it would go the two, like on Indomitable, on Implacable and Indefatigable, and the armored carriers with the pairs on either side forward. Then the single 4.7s is starboard and bow and starboard, along with the 40 millimeter pom poms paired with them, sort of along the way. That'd be a lot of fab. Just imagine the aircraft you could launch up there. Imagine the hangar space. Oh, it would have been gorgeous. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the question answer session, and take care. If you do like these videos, please do like, maybe subscribe, potentially press the little bell down there for more videos, and there's also Discord if you want to chat, and Patreon if you wish to support my book fund. I'm honest, that is what the Patreon money goes on, buying books, lots of them. I have expensive, as you can see from my army, an expensive habit. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.